Well, hello everyone, and welcome one and all to a very special edition of Arrow Nicely News. Today is Friday, November 24th, 2023. My name is Lenny Hernandez, and we've got a remarkable episode in store for you. Today is Native American Heritage Day, a very special day designated to pay tribute to Native Americans and their history and to honor them as the stewards and indigenous people of the land. To do our small part to acknowledge Native American heritage, Nicely News, friend of the show, Ayana King of Maximum Communications, sits down with Dez Stephens, founder and CEO of Radiant Health Institute. She is a humanitarian coach, social entrepreneur, people's advocate, and planetary advocate. And they talk about history, land acknowledgements, and the complicated and important task of allyship. I'm going to pass things over to Ayana and Dez now, so everyone please enjoy this very special episode of Arrow Nicely News.
Welcome, Dez. This is a special one today because it's November. The holiday season is starting. And we want to have a really good conversation about maybe what allyship really looks like. So everybody, I'm going to be your host today, Ayana King with Maximum Communications. And Dez, go ahead and introduce yourself. And then I'm going to talk about how Arrow and I came to do this work together and what I think it means for allyship and for those people who want to be advocates.
Nice. Well, I'm Dez Stephens. I am the founder and CEO of Radiant Health Institute, which is a lot of different things. But basically, I am here as an ally, as an advocate, as an activist to have these beautiful conversations. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And we know that November is Native American Heritage Month, which is another really important reason for us to be having this specific conversation. Arrow is invested in advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to do that not just in words, but we want to make sure that our actions match what our hearts are saying. And so we want to give this opportunity, not for ourselves selfishly, but also for others who might be watching to really understand what advocacy, what activism, what allyship can really look like. And I think that's important because, again, November is Native American Heritage Month. So one of the things that Arrow is doing this month is rolling out their land acknowledgements. And so in doing that, I reached out to you and I learned a lot. So why don't we start off with, why don't you tell us what a land acknowledgement is and maybe why a land acknowledgement is important?
Thank you so much for this question, because I think land acknowledgement, that term gets thrown out quite a bit, and people are being sensitive culturally and otherwise to what they think that means. So I will just tell you what it means to me. And of course, I'm not the expert in this, but I am certainly someone who is knowledgeable about what this means. And so really, when you think about colonization, you think about land grabbing. So Native Americans, Indigenous peoples did not consider this land, this continent, Turtle Island is what they call it, by the way, as their own. They did not consider owning the land. So, but they kind of considered that they owned a section of areas that were not someone else's section, but it was more like a collective. Okay. So if someone comes in, like a colonizer, and says, hey, I want to buy up your land, their interpretation of that is like, oh, they're coming into the collective. They want to coexist with us. They didn't literally think of that as like owning the actual land or buying the actual land. So a lot of the land grabbing was kind of inadvertent. Like, oh, I didn't realize that's what you meant. You know, that was a mistaken, well, let's just say the intentions of the land grabbers, they did not explain that. Okay. So when we acknowledge that it's someone else's land, this is the dichotomy. Indigenous peoples didn't consider themselves as landowners. They considered themselves as stewards of the land. Yes. So let's talk about the Mashpee Wampanoag, at Plymouth, Massachusetts. This is that, quote, first Thanksgiving kind of language. Oh. So these peoples that were there were kind of sort of fighting with these other peoples called the Narragansett out of kind of Rhode Island, where Rhode Island is now. And they said to the English, after a very, very harsh winter, can you help us like stave off these people over here, you know? And they had been so harmed already by the disease that they brought over, the harsh winters that they were trying to help the English with. So the land acknowledgement would be something like, I live, I work, and I learn on the land of the former blank people who used to live in this place, right? That's kind of what that means. So in this case, if you live in Plymouth, Massachusetts, you might say, I live, work, and learn on the lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag. So the Mashpee Wampanoag consider themselves, their language kind of says, we are the people of the light. And that's the translation into English of their name. And they date themselves back 12,000, sometimes 14,000 years. By the way, well, a lot of people don't know this, is that because of the Spanish and the French having come over previous to the Mayflower, there was a lot of, like, basically the chief of the Mashpee Wampanoag already had been to England and back, spoke English a little bit. People don't know that. They just assume the ship comes over from Britain and these people, you know, these native peoples and these British people are, you know, having this breaking of bread, right? That's kind of that Thanksgiving myth, right? So
That's what I grew up learning.
Right, of course. That's what they teach you in the school, right? Columbus discovered America, right? All that stuff, right? So I think what's really interesting about November as Native American Heritage Month is that Columbus Day preceded this. What is now in part called Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's not switched over to Indigenous Peoples Day. It's just also Indigenous Peoples Day. So see how that compromise isn't quite compromising, right?
Right.
So I think it's subjective for everyone, but for me, a land acknowledgement is, I'm from Chicago, and that's a frog swamp area, Mukwonago, Milwaukee, Chicago, all these words, they're Indigenous words, right? So I grew up in a place and I can attribute what nations lived there before I did. And then I moved to Iowa to go to college. And then I moved to California to go to college. And then I lived in Tennessee, and now I live in Florida, right? So everywhere that I live and work, I'm also learning. Like, I'm in the Seminole Nation area now. In Tennessee, I was where some of the Cree and the Cherokee were, the Shawnee. And, you know, I can look up, kind of, sort of, who used to be where I am currently living and working. So I can acknowledge that I am living on unceded land, that I am living where someone else had land taken away from them. And a genocide occurred on this continent. So I can acknowledge what land that I own, right? In a way that respects the history of what happened in this place.
Yes. And so I have to talk about, because I am a truth teller and also a truth seeker, how humbling it really was for me to draft a land acknowledgement, and how you gave me a lesson that I'm grateful for and that I was able to pass on. So I don't have a lot of experience, as I said, in the Native American community. I was very thankful that you were there to help me and guide me, because I think that the land acknowledgement that I thought was appropriate had the potential to cause harm. And it wasn't intentional. It was my words. And so I remember in the original, you remember this, okay? Very well-meaning. I was like, we're committed. You know, I used words like, you know, we have a responsibility. I used all of these words to really, quite innocently, convey what I knew was Arrow's mission, was to be welcoming, to be inclusive, to acknowledge, okay, what has occurred and where we are today. But I'll never forget this. You told me, you said you used the colonizers' language. That hit me. That struck me. And what probably was, to me, short anyway, maybe a 6 or 7 sentence land acknowledgement turned into maybe a 2-sentence, very simple land acknowledgement, which I won't give away today because I know that Errol will be unveiling that. But That's a lesson I'm really grateful for, because it's not our words, it's the things that we do. So,
I love how you're talking about condensing this, because we can get very wordy, can't we? Like,
right.
we are trying to do our best in the language we know. And this language that you and I are speaking right now is only about 1,500 years old, very young compared to the languages otherwise on the planet. And I think it's really important to simplify, minimalize, and be concise with our language. What do we really mean by what we're saying?
Yes.
So for me, a land acknowledgement, let's say on my e-signature of my emails, I live, work, and learn in the former land of the Seminole. That's all I need to say. My intention behind it, well-intentioned, pure, that means more. The energetic intention means more, and our words matter, because Arrow, when they unveil these land acknowledgement, that's going to be very meaningful to the peoples of those places. And I love how you're reducing the harm, because we can get very verbose, about what we're trying to do here, when really it's about simple terminology and simple, kind, and respectful language.
Yes. And so we had that conversation, and then I began to think even a little further. What is the action behind this acknowledgement? We know why they're important, but what does partnership look like? And so we had a conversation again about what could that look like? And out of that conversation and many conversations with Arrow's team, we decided, well, we need to establish relationships with the indigenous communities in our regions. And so we said, maybe what we'll do is we'll look for artists who can commission pieces to acknowledge, or that can complement our land acknowledgements. We talked about, because of your suggestion, the flags of each nation. And a key team member said something that I thought was beautiful. She said, maybe we should think about flying their flag alongside of the US flag. And I was like, I hadn't thought about that. And quite honestly, for some people, that would be radical, right? And so I just want to
imagine how radical it would feel if you were an indigenous person. You go to Washington, D.C., and you see this beautiful circle of flags representing the states and these broken treaty rights. There's not one flag of their nation in Washington, D.C., publicly displayed. So in the film that I know you watch, End of the Line, The Women of Standing Rock, they go to Washington, D.C., and they sing and they dance at the Capitol, and they look up and they say, not one of our flags is represented here. So the fact that even someone thought to do that is so beautiful to me, because, I go to the post office and I see the POW flag sometimes. I see a half-mast flag sometimes, and I don't ever hear anyone talking about the beautiful flags that were at Standing Rock in 2016 through 2018. When you drove into the main camp where we were filming, hundreds of flags we ran out of flagpoles. And these were U.S. veterans that came to support. These are not just indigenous peoples here, but we had a row of flags. And those flags have a lot of meaning. When you think about, have you ever been on vacation somewhere and you love their flag? You're like, oh, that Barbados flag is so awesome. So you think about flags, on our phone, we can pick those flags, right?
And
all those countries. Yeah. Not one of them is an indigenous nation flag. Maybe iPhones will add that someday.
Maybe they will. Maybe after they see this, they will. Yeah. That was very telling too. I remember seeing that in the documentary. And so I think in the spirit of inclusion, we have to be asking ourselves about the gaps. Who are we missing? Who are we not including? And so I'm just really proud of all the work that Arrow has been doing over these last few years to not just say the right things, but to do things that really align with the things that they say. So what are some things that you think an everyday person could do or should know about the indigenous communities, especially as we're going into the Thanksgiving season, the holiday season? We're going to be with family and friends. And I always say, listen, when you learn something new, don't hoard that information, right? Share it in communities where you have influence. Okay.
Yes.
So what are some things that maybe we should know? Maybe some causes that we should know that are affecting indigenous communities right now? And how could we be better allies?
Such an important question. So I think if you're a reader, I think it's important to read some information. I would recommend a book like American Holocaust, which talks about the genocide of the indigenous peoples on this continent. The Firekeeper's Daughter, a novel about a teen indigenous girl trying to make a difference. A book like Where White Men Fear to Tread by Russell Means, who was in part a co-founder of the American Indian movement in the 60s and 70s. So you can read about it, you can Google it by any means, but I think something like Thanksgiving is such an important kind of apex to this, which is Columbus Day, as we learned in school incorrectly, was not the discoverer of the Americas. So we learned a little bit about that. You can Google some of that stuff. It's an Indigenous Peoples Day for a reason. Native American Heritage Month is kind of an interesting term because Indigenous peoples is a little more contemporary. American Indian, even though that sounds a little strange, was meant to be like a red power movement, like the Black Power movement.
Okay.
So red power and Black power. So that's why Russell Means and people like that would say, if you're going to call me an Indian, because Columbus was looking for the west coast of India when he accidentally found the Caribbean, call me an American Indian because I'm an American too, right? So that American Indian thing might be a little outdated for young people now, but that meant a lot to people like Russell Means back in South Dakota, where he's from the Pine Ridge Reservation. Oglala Sioux is what he is. So if you want to learn about reservations, there's a lot of resources. I love the Lakota People's Law Project, which is addressing treaty breaks and systemic oppression as a result of colonialism. So I think, if you want to donate, I always say donate to my elder because we have elders who need support. My elder is 67 years old. He's on disability. He's in a wheelchair. He had a gunshot wound about 35 years ago. So he is supported by his supporters. Strong Heart Bear is my elder. He's an Anishinaabe. He's from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He currently lives in Tennessee. StrongHeartBear.com. I always say, make a donation to someone like that because people ask me what should I do besides watching the film that you co-executive produced? So there's this feeling at the end of the movie, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do, right?
Yes.
So allyship can look like this. It can look like not calling it Columbus Day, not calling it Thanksgiving without the context of what Thanksgiving really was. And it wasn't the breaking of the bread and this friendly exchange. It was more about colonizers exploiting Indigenous peoples. So it's not to say you shouldn't have Thanksgiving. It's not to say you shouldn't be thankful on Thanksgiving, whatever it means to you subjectively, but the context is problematic. And so if you have Friendsgiving, which it's morphed into, it's a day of mourning. It's a national day of mourning for this nation, the Mashpee Wampanoag of Plymouth, Massachusetts area. So I think it's kind of like saying, what if I celebrated the first day that West Africans were brought to the shores of the Americas? What day is that?
Hurtful.
So if we have a BIPOC conversation and I'm talking about the I and you can talk about the B, I can talk about unpacking my whiteness and you can talk about what your Blackness informs your life and the history and the background of that. And me being in part Indigenous, I can talk about the I, but I'm in the room. I'm not seated at the table of that room. My elder would be, right? So I respect my elder. So people say, who can I donate to? I say, strongheartbear.com. What can I support? Well, if you want to support some lawyers that are making a political difference, the Lakota People's Law Project, which I think is like lakotaproject.org, something like that. But it's just there are entities that are working in this space that you can be an ally to, right? You can read books, you can Google things, you can inform yourself. You can become an informed participant in this relationship, which, we don't want anyone to feel bad that they're celebrating Thanksgiving, but we want to acknowledge that it's also a day of mourning for Indigenous peoples because the Mashpee Wampanoag regret that they tried to create an allyship with the colonizers. And that is what other nations, as in 570 or so other Native American nations, they are regretful that they tried to partner with the colonists. So it just trickled out beyond that. And here's just an interesting statistic. So I think it was 1637. So, 15 or so years after the quote first Thanksgiving, which is debatable what date that is and what year that was. But let's just say the first one was 1620 in September, which now is November. Abraham Lincoln kind of established like a national holiday for this. So 700 indigenous peoples were murdered in 1637 or so in what's now Mystic, Connecticut. And they were Rhode Island indigenous peoples, like where Rhode Island is now. And it was a giving thanks for the slaughter. Like that was another giving thanks from the people who killed those 700 people. So it wasn't the first Thanksgiving, which some people say is 1535, by the way, and 16 something before 1620. But one of the Thanksgivings was a white man thanking God for the slaughter of children, men, and women the night before this feast. So that's the kind of thing that when you go down that rabbit hole and that wormhole, you're like, whoa, wait, what? They didn't teach me that at school, right? So we have to inform ourselves. It's not that we should feel guilty. It's not that we should feel shame. That's not what this is about. But it's important to know the information, right? Yeah. If I said to someone, how many people died in the Holocaust? They might know that number because they maybe were kind of taught in school that number, but they've never been taught this other number. They've never been taught the number of the West Africans brought to these shores of the Americas. We weren't taught why they are called the Americas. Yes. That has to do with Queen Isabella in Spain. So Christopher Columbus, this Italian explorer that she hired, comes over, doesn't even hit North America, goes back, comes back, a bunch of French, a bunch of, colonizers are coming back and forth. And one of those people was Americo Vespucci, one of Christopher Columbus's cohorts. And he mapped out the Americas because his name is Americo. So even people that say Native American, they say, don't say that because I'm not an American, because I'm not part of any of that story. I'm an indigenous person. Right.
So I want to talk about that for a second, even language, right? I sort of told you how clunky it felt to me as a person who was learning. What do I say? Do I say Native American? Do I say American Indian? Do I say indigenous community?
Do I say Black? Do I say African American?
Yes, right. So that's why I think these conversations are so important, and we cannot be afraid to learn something new. And sometimes even when we learn something new, it can be upsetting, right? It cannot feel good.
Here's something that I do on Thanksgiving. My mom is 79, so she's all excited this year that I'm going to come to her potluck with her friends and bring dessert. So I'm not going to have this conversation at Thanksgiving. I remember growing up, I was a vegetarian when I was little. The rest of the family was not. And I would get this, like, why aren't you eating turkey? That was the conversation I had as a kid. But the conversation now is not, why should we not celebrate Thanksgiving? What I do is I acknowledge the maize, the corn that I'm eating. All these foods that we deliciously eat on Thanksgiving came from indigenous peoples, right? So I honor that. I might say, I'm really grateful to the peoples who introduced us white people, to this kind of food and this kind of blessing and this kind of feast. I might, say a prayer or an acknowledgement verbally or some kind of, toast or something that I honor the indigenous peoples who had the original Thanksgiving back in 1620 and, 400 and so years ago. So I might verbally do something. I might have a conversation with my mom is a boomer. She's not going to want to hear about any of this, in the context of like, well, why are you spoiling my Thanksgiving meal? But I might pull her aside and might say, Mom, I'm also going to acknowledge on this day, a lot of people fast, by the way, this National Day of Mourning, Indigenous peoples, many of them fast from midnight, the night before, all the way through one day, because it is a form of social justice activity, I'll just say. Just like in Gaza, just like in Israel right now, there are people fasting. They're saying,
Yes.
I'm not going to eat if, I'm sorry, a food strike. A lot of people are food striking.
Okay.
So those holy wars that have been happening for centuries, they've also been happening here. On every continent, in every experience, with every groups of peoples, there is ethnic cleansing, and that's a horrible history of our country. But it's not conversation necessarily at the Thanksgiving meal.
Right.
So it's really about, maybe I am going to read a book. Maybe I am going to donate $10 a month to Lakota People's Law Project. Maybe I'm going to make a donation to an elder to support the work, the ceremonial work. Maybe I'm going to do a land acknowledgement in my email signature, right? There's small things we can do, but they do make a big difference.
They really do. Maybe what we're going to do is remember this conversation. And when we've heard some new information, when our heart has been stirred about something that we heard, we will share that information in circles where we have influence. Dez, thank you so much for your time, for your knowledge, for your spirit. I know that I am so grateful for our friendship, and I know that Arrow is too. So please come back, share with us whenever, and I hope that we'll be able to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
What an absolutely wonderful conversation. We are always eager to learn more and improve our understanding of our place in this land and improve our relationship to the people who first called this land home. A huge thank you to Ayana and to Dez. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and be sure to come back in 7 short days for even more uplifting and joyful stories. For Arrow Nicely News, I'm Lenny Hernandez. Have a wonderful weekend, an even better week, and we will see you all next Friday.